So we've had an uptick in sort of like plots and foiled plots and acts of political violence, usually at a pretty low level, that has kind of ticked up since about 2020. 2020 sort of was the first period in which we saw the most recent uptick in political violence. That said, though, the level of political violence we're seeing today in the United States is not necessarily as high as it was like in 1969, 1970, in the 80s, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have that sort of that jagged cliff of ups and downs here. We're on right now sort of like a little bit of an uptick. James Piazza, Political Science Department. I'm liberal arts professor of political science at Penn State. So I teach a class on political violence in the United States, and the first thing sort of we do in the semester in the class is talk about the history of political violence in the U.S. And we go through political violence that occurred in the colonial period, the early Republican period, and the run-up to the Civil War, in the World War I era, the early 19-teens and the 1960s, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, political violence is not something that's particularly new in the United States. It has a storied history. So the run-up to the Civil War is sort of the nightmare scenario that a lot of commentators are worried about. That was a period in which you had pretty stark polarization divisions, not between Democrats and Republicans in the way we have today in terms of our current political environment, but between people that were advocates of slavery and then abolitionists, right? And the 1850s was this period in which you saw kind of both sides start to advocate and engage in political violence, right? While there are some themes that seem kind of familiar to us, that seem to be similar from that era to this era, the level of animosity, the tolerance of political violence is thankfully not as high as during that time period, right? The increase in political violence is not nearly as steep as what we've seen in these previous areas, the 19-teens, the 1850s, the 1960s, right? We sort of like, I don't believe, thankfully, I don't believe that we're there yet. There's been a lot of research as to what's going on in the wider environment in the United States that might be explaining political violence here. And there's kind of a lot of factors that might explain that. The United States is extremely polarized. There's a lot of political polarization in the US, and polarized environments tend to produce a lot more political violence. People hate one another, they mistrust one another and the government, et cetera, et cetera. And that creates an environment in which you can see more political violence. The type of language that politicians use in public is very demonizing and dehumanizing. These are factors that have been linked to increased acceptability of political violence, normalization of political violence, and then occurrence of political violence. Social media also plays a pretty important role here with disinformation and conspiracy theories, fostering even more polarization. So a lot of experts sort of argue that the social media environment in the United States is quite polarizing, and it allows for the spread of disinformation, misinformation that might fuel conspiratorial thinking, which also reinforces political violence. In the United States, there is a really shockingly sort of steep growth in distrust and mistrust of government, the democratic system, political systems. We're living sort of in a heyday of that. And research that I've done sort of shows that when Americans, people that distrust the political system, that are skeptical of democratic institutions and norms, are particularly prone to being supportive of political violence. I want to be very, very clear. That does not necessarily mean that they are likely to perpetrate political violence, but they are much more normalizing and accepting of political violence in a way that might produce an environment in which political violence can occur without more backlash. We need politicians, political leaders, influencers, commentators from across the political spectrum to unequivocally denounce political violence, to say it's okay for us as Americans to disagree with each other, but the use of political violence is something that's absolutely unacceptable. And that needs to happen across the political spectrum. When, studies show that voters, citizens listen to their leaders, right? And when trusted leaders are telling people to calm down, to be conciliatory towards one another, to not take the bait of demonization, dehumanization, that can remedy political violence. I think that the average person can, number one, try to be literate and thoughtful about their social media and information usage, right? We're just absolutely bombarded by disinformation on social media, and I think that skepticism about information and a willingness to kind of look at multiple sources and verify is something that's that is something that we can all do as consumers of news, to be able to sort of like de-radicalize or counter-radicalize, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's very, very important for us to, as outraged as we can become by politics today, to try the best we can to understand that people that disagree with us politically, right, have a different idea about how America's government should be run, public policy laws should be enacted, et cetera, et cetera. And to not assume that those people have nefarious or evil or immoral motivations for that. They have a different view of how America should be run. It doesn't mean that they are malevolent, right? I've seen that I'm getting these